we even describe this? What all is going on? What does history even look like? In our last video, we mentioned that this one coming up right here was going to be a spoiler episode. So right here we are going to be talking about our story plotline for our first book. So if you don't want to have the plot or the potential plot spoiled, click off this video, find another one of our videos that is not marked spoiler. But if you're fine with having a little bit spoiled, then stick around and let's dig into what the story is going to be about.
So last time we talked about the fact that we have kind of the bones of the story, but we hadn't yet figured out how to connect them, and we really had two different kinds of challenges. One was that we didn't really know how to connect the bones in a way that they would make sense to turn the story into a plot, where this happens because thing A happened, therefore thing B had to happen. And the other one is, because this is a time travel story and people make decisions in the future that affect the past, how to even describe what the story is got a little bit confusing. But I think we figured out how to describe that story in a way that kind of makes sense.
So we'll go ahead and give you kind of the high-level structure of what this story is going to look like. So we're starting out with a 16-year-old or so protagonist, and they meet the supporting character, and together somehow they discover that they are unique in that they are genetically modified humans that have been sent back in time by future scientists. They were sent back when they were babies, so they grew up not really knowing their true identity. They realized that they were sent back in order to prevent a disaster that was happening around the time that the scientists actually sent them back from. And along their path, they meet people who are impeding their progress and making it more difficult or changing the things that they have to do in order to prevent this disaster. And we get to the point where right before this disaster occurs, our main character goes unconscious, and he regains consciousness only after the disaster has been prevented.
And so then later on in his story, this main character discovers that in a previous version of history, the disaster did occur. This was before they were sent back. In a version in which they had not been sent back, the disaster had occurred, and the world kind of responded to that disaster by becoming more resilient to that kind of a problem and to that kind of a threat. And because of that additional resilience, a future disaster that was even greater had been prevented as a result of that development. But in that future, a different group had wanted to exploit the weakness, but they couldn't because the world had grown resilient. So that group, it turns out, was the one who sent back in time the information to those scientists we learned about earlier to teach them how to genetically modify the human beings and how to send them back in history. And so this, by preventing the first disaster, they would keep the world weak enough to be susceptible to that threat so that the group could take over the world through that threat of the second disaster.
So as our main character grows up, he realizes all this, realizes that the fact that he prevented the disaster means that this even greater disaster is going to occur, so he works to try to change the way in which the first disaster was prevented, so that way not only is that one prevented, but that the world still grows resilient enough for that second disaster also not to happen. So that is going to involve him sending back in time somebody to change the way in which the first disaster was prevented, and we find out that that is one of the people that we meet in the first part of the story who is actually making it more difficult for the main character and the supporting character to prevent that first disaster.
And we also learned during that area that while the main character was unconscious, the way we told it the first part of the story, that's where, from the other people's perspective, the prevention of the disaster did not go according to the main character's plan.
Right.
Then, finally, when he wakes up, we retell the part of the story where he wakes up after the disaster was prevented. And in this version of that history, as we're retelling that story, things are a little bit different in ways that we haven't yet figured out. But they do reflect the fact that the impeder in that first version was, in fact, the one who the main character, the old version of the main character, had sent back, and he was successful in changing the way that Disaster 1 was handled. So that's kind of a high level. And now you see why it was so hard to describe the story.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time just talking back and forth, figuring out how do we even describe this, what all is going on, what does history even look like before the story picks up. So because we involve people being sent back in time, and there's a lot of the story that isn't actually, that is part of the story, but also not really part of the book, because it's kind of background and we're building on things, so really confusing. I hope that this made at least some sense to you. But as we're looking at this, there are a lot of why questions, and that's something that we mentioned last week. There are a lot of questions that we're having that we need answered in order to have a good plot, not just a good story. So one of the why questions that we're going to need to figure out how we answer is this group who wanted Disaster 2 to happen, and so they were trying to prevent Disaster 1 so Disaster 2 could happen. Why was it that they sent back information to the scientists and then had them send back genetically modified humans? Why couldn't this group have just genetically modified people and sent them back in time? Why did they have to use a middleman to accomplish their purpose? And then in addition, why couldn't they have used some other disaster? Why is this disaster specifically the only one that they can use to accomplish their purpose? Instead of finding some other disaster or anything else rather than using specifically this one disaster.
Because either of these, time travel, it's convoluted, it's messy. It seems like there ought to be an easier way to do it, but for us to have a good story, well, it's a time travel story, so we need a good reason why those things were the best way to accomplish something. And then another question to answer is, what is it about Disaster 1 that would prevent Disaster 2? Or said the other way around, what is it about preventing Disaster 1 that allowed Disaster 2? How are these two related?
Mm-hmm. Another why question, if we put ourselves in the perspectives of the scientists who are sending back the genetically modified humans, they've gotten information from the future somehow. Why do they trust this information that they're getting? And why do they believe that this is the only course of action? The only way we can do this is to send people back in time. Again, a very convoluted solution to this problem, but somehow in order for our plot to work, these scientists have to believe that what they're doing is right and is the best possible way that they can do this.
Especially since we've never done this before, this is all brand new, so...
Right.
But yeah, let's do it. We'll try. And also, the genetically modified humans that do get sent back in time, they're sent back as babies, and they grow up, and we pick up the story when they're 16. Why in the world do they agree that this role that somebody has imagined for them is the right thing for them to do? And yeah, we're going to go along with our part of this narrative to prevent this disaster. We're going to go put ourselves at risk.
Another why question, this is all the way towards the end of the timeline, if not the end of the story, because we kind of go back at the end. But the main character in his old age, in order to change the way the first disaster was prevented, or to make it so that disaster 2 doesn't happen, he again resorts to time travel. And so there's that question again, why is time travel the best solution? And we don't want the answer to be, well, it's because it's a time travel book.
Right.
That is not how we get good plot, even if it is a kind of a good story. But why is time travel chosen? And then the person that he sends back in time, why are they willing to travel back in time, knowing that they're going to be stuck back here? There's no time machine then to go forward. They're going to have to live their life out in the past. So why are they willing to do that? And for all of these, we have some ideas, but we really don't know exactly where we're going with that.
Right, they're all kind of rough ideas.
So in future spoiler episodes, you can look forward to us kind of figuring out these why questions, hashing out answers to them, things that we think might be good answers to these why questions, so that we have a good plot, not just a good story.
But if you've listened to this and you think, you know what, I think that's enough of the story, I don't think I want to hear anymore, I would like to be surprised as I read the book, go ahead and check out the spoiler-free playlist. There we go.
Say that 5 times fast.
Yeah, so check out the spoiler-free playlist that you can see on the main YouTube. Actually, we'll figure out how you get there.
Yeah.
You know how YouTube works.
If you're enjoying coming along on this journey with us, please like and subscribe so that you don't miss videos as they come out. And invite your friends to join us on this journey as we figure out what it's like to write a book, what it's like to write collaboratively. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.